What's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. It's your girl Alicia Nicole. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of AD's RX for MD. So today's video is long overdue, and I'm actually on my surgery rotation right now, but I just never had the time to sit and record a video on my internal medicine rotation. I had like clips here and there, but I never did the full kind of like sit down summary overview structure. So in this video, I want to talk about the structure of my internal medicine rotation, what services I was on during the rotation, what the hours were like generally, the expectations of the students, and then I want to talk about what study resources I used as well as my study method. So first, let's just talk about the structure of the rotation. Across the board, I think at any school, internal medicine is definitely going to be the longest clerkship just because there is so much to internal medicine. And there's so many specialties that you can go into from internal medicine. So our school wanted to make sure we had as much exposure as possible to the different subspecialties. So it was a total of 12 weeks. 6 of those weeks were spent on inpatient wards, and they were kind of arranged in different ways. There was no specific arrangement like, oh, you have to do all 6 at one time. They kind of just, I feel like, randomly distributed. And then the remaining 6 weeks were divided among ambulatory, which was just clinic, and then 2 electives. So some of the options we could do for our electives were like renal, cardiovascular, pulmonary, infectious disease, GI. Those are the ones that are sticking out in my mind right now. So the way my schedule was, I started with 2, and it was 2 weeks at a time on each thing. So I started with 2 weeks of inpatient wards. So what is that? What did that look like? Inpatient wards is just taking care of patients that are hospitalized that are not on a special service. Well, actually, sometimes the internal medicine team would have patients that were also on other services, just depending on how complex their case was. So, for example, a patient might come in and initially be on internal medicine, and then we find out there's some cardiovascular thing going on. Maybe they have an abnormal echo. Then we would consult cardio, and cardio would come in and give whatever recommendations, do whatever tests, but then usually that consult service would sign off, and then that patient would continue to be managed by the inpatient internal medicine team. So those days, typically we were requested to be prepared to round at 7 o'clock. We didn't always actually round at 7 o'clock. Sometimes it's like 7:38. But I would arrive at the hospital at 6 a.m. so that I could chart check patients, choose who I was going to see that day, pre-round on them, go see them, and then be ready and ask the resident any questions that I had if I was uncertain about the plan. And then later when the attending showed up, we would either do floor rounds or table rounds. And in very rare cases, we would do both. So when rounds came, then we would present our patients kind of in a usually in a SOAP format if they were someone that the team had been following for a while. Typically the days were like technically it was supposed to be to 5, but we often left around 2 or 3 o'clock, just because a lot of times after seeing patients in the morning and rounding, there may not have been a ton to do. And so a lot of times the residents would let us go. Every 4th day though, so there were 5 internal medicine inpatient teams, and they all took turns taking long call. So long call is 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And so we were supposed to stay for those. I think I only stayed for 1 or 2 though, because a lot of times long call ended up being on days where like we had something else to do in the afternoon, and they were like, okay, well, it's fine, just go home after that thing. That's pretty much what inpatient looked like. We were expected to see 2, sometimes 3 patients a day. If I had 2 patients that I was really familiar with, then I would go ahead and take a 3rd patient for that day, but that was like the max. And I would definitely not take 3 new patients. 2 new patients was a lot for me. Just as a med student, kind of learning how to be efficient and trying to find your groove, I'd say 2 patients is probably what will be expected. And then we also wrote notes while we were on inpatient. Internal medicine is probably the rotation where I wrote the most notes. But for our 2 patients we saw, we were expected to write the SOAP notes. If someone was a new patient or had not had a prolonged hospital stay, like they were coming in for a very acute problem, then we would do a full history and physical, or H&P, which would include an HPI, which was usually more lengthy, kind of giving the history if there was one. full review of systems, past medical history, surgical, social, all of that stuff we were expected to fill in. And some of it kind of auto-populated. So that's what inpatient looked like. I spent 2 weeks on that initially. Then I went to GI, I believe, for another 2 weeks. So GI was cool. Pretty much my time was split between looking at scopes in the GI lab and then going to clinic. On scope days, it was pretty relaxed. It wasn't very strict at all. It was kind of like, hey, just go look at the schedule, see who's doing what, go in and see whatever you want. There was also a fourth year that was doing a GI AI at that time, or acting internship. So he was pretty helpful to help me learn the ropes and for whatever questions I had that maybe a resident didn't have time to answer at that moment. But yeah, it was pretty straightforward. Just upper endoscopies and colonoscopies is pretty much the extent of what I saw while I was on GI. And then when I went to clinic, it would be a half day usually in clinic, and it was either at the GI clinic or the hepatology clinic specifically. And at the clinics, though, I was definitely really involved. So basically the setup was that there was the attending, there were several residents, and there were advanced practice practitioners, I think is what they're called, like nurse practitioners and PAs. Then there was the fourth year student, and then there was me. So we kind of all just tackled patients. You would just put your initials by who you were going to see. So it's kind of a first come, first serve thing. I didn't see that many patients just because there were so many people there seeing patients. And also as a med student, I was a little slower. That's pretty much what clinic looked like. Definitely a lot of independence, but a good balance of independence and supervision. Then I believe I had 2 more weeks of inpatient, which we talked about. So we're at 2, 4, 6 weeks. Then I had 2 weeks of infectious disease. I didn't really know what to expect from infectious disease. I usually wrote 2 notes. Again, I would typically see 2 patients a day, unless it was 2 that I've been following for a few days. Then I'd be like, oh, I feel comfortable taking on a new one. I would typically arrive, it's so foggy, I think 6, either 6 or 7. We did table rounds in the late morning, and then we would do floor rounds in the afternoon. So my hours were 7 to 3-ish, if I'm remembering correctly. So not too bad. I would see patients in the morning, and then the residents, it was just 2 residents on that team. And with it being a consult service, it wasn't quite as busy as internal medicine. As inpatient, because with inpatient, there's just a lot more that you were managing on a lot more patients. And with infectious disease, we may get consulted on 3 people that day. When we would go to table rounds, I would present my patients, typically in the SOAP format again. All right, so we're now at week 8. Let's see. Then I did 2 weeks of ambulatory, which was clinic. For all intents and purposes, this looked pretty similar to what family medicine clinic would be like. And some people kind of go the internal route and ultimately do end up working in outpatient clinics, which, is very, very similar to if you go the family medicine route. The difference really, though, is just if you go through the internal medicine training, you're going to learn a lot more about inpatient management of chronic diseases. And so you'll have that as a background, even if you choose to go the outpatient route. But this, again, can't really remember. There was no rounding involved, so it was kind of more so just show up and see patients. I want to say it was 8 to 3 or 4. Most days I was out by 3. 4:30 was a long day. And I would typically see maybe 2 patients, maybe 3. That was mostly just because a lot of people kind of no-showed or canceled or whatever. And so a lot of times there just weren't a ton of patients to be seen. So that's pretty much what ambulatory looked like. And then I ended on inpatient again, which I talked to you about earlier. The structure was exactly the same. So, just overall thoughts on internal medicine. It was definitely a clerkship that I struggled with just because of the depth of knowledge that's required. 9 times out of 10, the patients that you have are going to be complex patients, which means they have a lot more than just one thing going on. So it's not uncommon for you to be dealing with a patient who may have heart failure and high blood pressure and diabetes and liver failure. They're very complex patients. And so coming up with a plan for a patient that's that complex initially can be pretty intimidating as a med student. It definitely was for me, and a little bit overwhelming. What I will say though is that you do see certain things a lot, and then you start to recognize overwhelming. I didn't start to feel like I was really learning things until the very end. So I felt very much overwhelmed for like at least 8 weeks, maybe 9 weeks. What are other thoughts on internal medicine? It is definitely a service where rounds are very long. Table rounds, typically, let's see, if we started table rounds around 8:30, 9 o'clock, it was not uncommon for us to either be done or still not be done by like noon, even 1 o'clock. Just because there's so many patients on the list usually, and they're so complex, and there's a lot to consider for each patient, so it just takes a long time to talk through it. But floor rounding obviously was much quicker because the attending was very familiar with the patients by the time it was time to do the floor rounds. And then of course there are other specialties you can go into from internal medicine. That's one thing I'll say about internal med that's great about it, is if you are someone who gets to your 3rd or 4th year and you still are like, I really don't know exactly what it is I want to do. I've been through these clerkships and none of them have really been like my thing. Internal medicine could be a field to consider because number one, you will get really great comprehensive knowledge of how to manage patients, but you have a ton of options for things you could do after that. I think those are my overall thoughts on the clerkship. And then finally, I will just share what I used to study. It wasn't anything fancy. I literally just used UWorld. Unfortunately, I did not get through all the questions. I think I was just really overwhelmed at the start of the clerkship. And so it was hard to actually bring myself to do questions because I was getting a lot of them wrong. And then I was just so mentally exhausted from like feeling like there was too much going on during the day that I couldn't keep up with. And then there were all these topics I felt like I needed to research that a lot of times I just didn't get to questions. I did, do better kind of towards the like midway point and onward with questions. But at that point, like there's 1,200 questions. I needed to be doing 100 questions a week and I just didn't start doing that. So that's something I would do differently, is definitely try to get through all of those questions. So I used UWorld, I used Anki. And then I used Aquifer. I'm not going to lie, Aquifer wasn't really a main part of my study routine. It was just something that was required by our school, so I did it. I think this pretty much sums up all my thoughts and my experience with internal medicine. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share, and I will see you in the next video.